Hi, students. We are starting our discussion of existentialism with Fyodor Dostoyevsky's The Grand Inquisitor, which is a story within his novel, The Brothers Karamazov. So we're using this short story to think about what we call the death of God. This is a phrase that we get from Nietzsche to describe what happens when we sort of have this crisis in belief historically. So if you think about the way the world used to be, um, there was a connection between political power and spiritual power. So the church and the state very much were connected. And science and religion were also very much connected. So a lot of the beliefs were supported by religious belief. And that meant that there was a creator who was God, and he gave the world beauty and purpose and meaning. And you as a human were created with a specific essence given to you by God, which meant you had a purpose in life. And you know how you're supposed to behave and what you're supposed to do within this world that's ordered by God because you have commandments. Now, when religious beliefs are questioned and we have growing secularization in the world, we call that the death of God. And instead of having this divine order given to everything and everything having a sort of divine purpose to it, we now have to figure out what our purpose is. The universe is indifferent to your existence. There's not some God watching over you, watching your every move, giving your life meaning. And you really have to figure out what is right or wrong for yourself. You have to figure out what to do with your life to give it meaning and purpose and what it means to be a good human being. That idea is not given to you by God anymore. So the death of God kind of unsettles how we feel about our relation to the world, how we feel about ourselves. So Fyodor Dostoyevsky is a Russian novelist. He was someone who was Catholic, so he was Russian Orthodox, and he had a life full of suffering and absurdity. He was wrongfully imprisoned, and he actually stood before a firing squad and was saved at the last moment, but he saw his death in front of him very imminently. And then he ended up escaping into exile in Siberia, where he did forced labor. A lot of his writings have to do with Russian politics, especially critiques of the sort of serfdom, religion. He wrote a lot about the poor and disenfranchised and people who were suffering a lot. He wrote about mental illness and irrationality. He wrote a lot about love and despair and innocence and evil. So big topics. If you know anything about Russian novels, you know that they are about these sort of soul-crushing struggles with existence. So a Russian novel is about going to the depths of despair and then finding out there's an even deeper level of despair that you didn't know before. Russian novels are very intense, and we're only reading a small fragment of this one. So The Brothers Karamazov is what this short selection is from. It's a much bigger book. This is my copy from high school. It's about 800 pages, and this is one of my favorite books of all time. I reread this every so often because I think it's one of the sort of best ways of grappling with human existence. And it gives one of the best arguments for the existence of God, and it gives one of the best arguments for atheism. And it's incredible to me that one author would be able to write both of these arguments. So this is a very, very philosophical novel. Within the story, this is The Grand Inquisitor is a story that the character Ivan wrote. Ivan is an atheist, and he's telling the story to his younger brother Alyosha, who's a monk and in a monastery at the moment. And so he's giving this sort of argument against religion to his younger brother, who at the time is living at a religious institution. And before he even tells the story, Ivan explains why he doesn't believe in the idea of God and why he thinks the idea of God doesn't really make sense. And it's based on the fact that there's just so much suffering in the world. And Ivan tells a bunch of stories about innocent children suffering really intensely. It's a very hard chapter to read. And he asks Alyosha how there can be a God who's all-knowing and all-powerful and all all loving if there's suffering like this in the world? It seems like God would either not be all powerful or not be all loving. And so Ivan sets the story up during the Spanish Inquisition. If you don't know anything about the Spanish Inquisition, it really is a demonstration of the church's power at the time, their sort of political power, because they were essentially demanding these acts of faith and demanding that people follow the faith, and then burning lots and lots of people. So there was a lot of torture, a lot of sort of demonstration of faith by fire happening at this time. So we see a lot of corruption of power. We see a lot of demonstrations of power over people at this time. So Ivan is, in 19th century Russia, but he's telling a story about 16th century Spain. And in this story, Jesus comes back. Jesus died and was resurrected, and many people believe that hold that faith that he will come back again. And so Ivan's story is about Christ's second coming, which is supposed to be a time when the world sort of is renewed. And it's this beautiful story at first, right? Jesus is walking through crowds. They're drawn to him. He's this loving, beautiful presence. And then the Grand Inquisitor takes him and puts him in jail, right? So this religious figure who is supposed to worship God and love Christ, takes Christ and puts him in prison and interrogates him. And essentially what the Grand Inquisitor talks about is the fact that Jesus made a mistake. So in the Bible, there's 3 different accounts of this. But Jesus was in the desert fasting for 40 days, and Satan came to tempt him at the end of those 40 days. And Satan tempted him with 3 things. He offered him bread, right? He had been fasting, eating no food for 40 days and 40 nights. So he offered him bread, which for the Grand Inquisitor kind of represents material comfort, taking care of your bodily needs. He offered him, he asked that Jesus show a miracle. And this has to do with the certainty of belief and transcendence, right? If Jesus had performed a miracle, then that would demand that people believe in him. Faith and love require this sort of openness, right? Someone can't demand it of you. And the way the Grand Inquisitor thinks of miracles is that it's demanding that someone believe something. It creates a sort of certainty and this idea of transcendence. It makes it palpable so that people can have that belief and have it very firmly instead of choosing it. And then Satan shows him all the kingdoms in the world and says, these can be yours, you can rule these. So Satan essentially offers him earthly power and absolute rule over everything, and Jesus rejects that. And when the Inquisitor is talking about each of these, he talks about why humanity really needs those things that Jesus rejected. And so the Grand Inquisitor argues that essentially what Jesus offers is a sort of spiritual freedom, right? He's comes to the world, but he doesn't own the world. He wants people to come to him. He wants people to come love him and not to demand that they do certain things or that they love him in a particular way and that they have to form certain political or social institutions around him. And so in this story, the Grand Inquisitor says, look, people don't have the strength to have this type of faith. They can't bear this type of freedom you want to offer them. And so the Grand Inquisitor says that the church has corrected this mistake that Jesus made in rejecting Satan's temptations, and that the church has accepted all these temptations. The church has a great deal of materiality, right? It's very wealthy. There's a lot of material goods. They feed the poor. They take care of people's physical needs. He says that, the church also tells people what they're supposed to believe. They use miracles, they use spectacle in order to control people's beliefs, and they wield a great deal of earthly power, right? Especially at this particular time. The story's set, the church is this dominant political power over everyone. And so the Grand Inquisitor essentially says, we don't need you, Jesus, and I am going to kill you because we do not need you. And Jesus responds in the story by kissing the Grand Inquisitor. And so instead of killing Christ, the Grand Inquisitor lets him go, right? So there's this sort of ambiguity in that kiss. It can be interpreted in many ways. I like to think of it as a sort of unconditional act of love. If Jesus is supposed to represent this sort of absolute love and the sort of love that allows you to still be free, that doesn't make any demand of you, I think that kiss is really symbolic of it. Some people have likened it to Judas kissing Christ when he betrayed him. Other people think about the kiss as a sort of, there's no way that Christ can really respond in argument. There's not a rational argument to be made, and instead there's a sort of gesture that's given. I'm very curious what other people think this kiss might mean or how they interpret this story. So what the story is getting us to think about is, what are religious institutions? Are they something to be critiqued? Are they something that gives people what they need? Is there a difference between spirituality and belonging to a particular religious institution? Maybe religious institutions don't fully serve spirituality. Maybe spirituality is something different than that. Power, this story is very much about power, the sort of individual's relation to others, the struggle between power and freedom. And it's also a story about humanity. What does it mean to be human? What do humans need? What is human existence like? And we see the Grand Inquisitor has a pretty dark concept of what humanity is and what we're capable of. So I am looking forward to what you have to say about these ideas. Feel free to email me if you have any questions or want to set up a time to talk about this story.